Next, we're going to start looking at biological molecules. There's a couple of slides in this PowerPoint that just go through the four principal classes of biological molecules. You have carbohydrates that exist as small sugars called monosaccharides, or two monosaccharides linked together called disaccharides, and polysaccharides, which are many monosaccharides linked together. We can also look at proteins, which are known as peptides for short proteins, or polypeptides for longer proteins. And we can continue on and talk about nucleic acids like DNA and RNA that code for genetic information and help that information be processed into proteins, respectively. We could also look at lipids, which include fats, oils, and waxes, and phospholipids that make up the components of cell membranes, and steroids, which make up cell membranes and help form hormones. So that's a quick overview for what we're about to look at. But we're going to start with carbohydrates. We're going to take a closer look at what exactly do we mean when we say carbohydrate or carb. All carbohydrates are either small water-soluble sugars or much larger insoluble polymers of sugar. We've already looked at the three types of carbohydrates. You have monosaccharides, which are simple sugars, disaccharides, which are two monosaccharides linked together, a polysaccharide, which is many monosaccharides linked together, and these are just a couple of the different types. We can get more specific and talk about different types of monosaccharides, or examples of disaccharides and even polysaccharides. You're probably most familiar with polysaccharides, like starch and cellulose, or glycogen or chitin. You might not know you are, but we'll talk about these examples. Glucose is actually going to be the most common monosaccharide that we look at. So it's a primary energy source for cells. It's also known as the monomer of carbohydrates. Glucose has 6 carbons. A lot of organisms can synthesize different monosaccharides, not just glucose. Some synthesize fructose, like plants. Galactose is secreted by mammals in their milk, and we even have different sugars or monosaccharides in DNA and RNA, or types of nucleic acids, like ribose and deoxyribose. Deoxyribose is actually just missing an oxygen atom, whereas ribose has it. And when we look at disaccharides, we're really just looking at two monosaccharides linked together. They're linked together by dehydration synthesis, and so they're hydrolyzed and converted into glucose if needed by hydrolysis. But dehydration synthesis allows for the initial linking of different monosaccharides. So here are some examples of disaccharides. A glucose and a fructose covalently bonded together is sucrose, which is table sugar. Lactose or milk sugar is just glucose and galactose bonded together. And two glucose molecules covalently bonded is maltose or malt sugar. So we know monosaccharides are simple single sugars. Disaccharides are two sugars bonded together. Well, polysaccharides are going to just be more onto that topic. More monosaccharides, chains of monosaccharides, and we oftentimes see that these are very large and don't readily dissolve in water. They're insoluble. One example that you've probably been familiar with or even consumed is starch. Many plants store energy as starch, like potatoes. Starch consists of branched chains of up to 500,000 glucose subunits. So it's really just made of repeating branches of glucose. So we could break these bonds to release glucose for the plant cells to use. Glycogen is similar to starch, but it's in animals. So starch is to plants what glycogen is to animals. They are both going to be a series of glucose molecules attached to each other, but starch is much more branched than glycogen. Glycogen in humans is actually stored in the liver and skeletal muscles, and both can be used to produce glucose into the blood or into the systems for transport of plants and animals to provide sugar and readily available energy for an organism's cells. We also have cellulose, and it's more of a structural polysaccharide. So it's made up of many repeating units of glucose that help support plant cell walls, like in cotton balls. It actually is considered maybe the most abundant organic molecule, and it's just considered a polymer of glucose. That's what is meant by many repeating units of glucose making up cellulose. Now, there's some vertebrates that can digest cellulose. because they harbor cellulose digesting microbes. That's not us. We cannot digest cellulose, so we actually digest it as fiber or bulk. And then there's chitin, which is another structural polysaccharide. It makes up the exoskeletons of a variety of organisms and also the cell walls of fungus. It is similar to cellulose, but it has nitrogen functional groups which we don't see in cellulose. So you might see this, for example, in the exoskeleton of a spider. So chitin is just another example of a structural polysaccharide. Next, we're going to be looking at proteins, so make sure to keep following along so we look at all the biological molecules together.